everybody. Welcome to InPsightRadio. I am your host, Danielle Egnew, and you are a fly on the wall to everywhere. How have you been? You hanging in there? We're barreling through fall. It's been a beautiful fall up here in Montana. Honestly, it's pretty gorgeous, and I honestly can't complain about anything. Our COVID numbers are rising, and that's kind of been a bummer. I wish that wasn't happening. Yet that seems to be sort of a trend, and it's what I was seeing that all through October, we were going to be burying our numbers in the red, and really all across the United States as well. So I hope you're staying well. I've had just a regular old fall cold for the last couple of weeks, yet it was not COVID-19. It was just a bummer fall cold. But got the voice back, got everything back. We're back in the saddle, and we're ready to rock and roll here, gang. So here we are, and this is the third installment of our amazing aliens little triad of podcasts. And we, of course, have talked about the folks, the Oturan. We've talked about the folks from Sirius. And now, especially since we're coming into October here, I really want to hit something slightly creepy. Because, it's just not fun. It's not fun if we're doing October without just the slightest bit of creepyliciousness here. And so we're going to be looking at the Greys, 50 Shades of Greys. Who are they? What are they? Why do they keep showing up all over the place? And the Greys, they're kind of an intense group. And they're what we like to look at in our lore a lot of times, our alien lore. I mean, my God, look at the incredible franchise of I Must Believe. Come on, X-Files gang, right? I want to believe. The Greys were this massive point of, I guess you could say, storyline for the whole X-Files, the entire series, really. And so when we think about alien abduction, when we think about aliens, we oftentimes are thinking about the Greys. And what's interesting about that is that the Greys are related to the beings from Otur. And they look somewhat similar in that they have the round, baldy heads and the three-pronged fingers, except the gray bodies look a lot different. Now, most of us, when we think of the term extraterrestrial or alien, most of us think about grays, right? Most of us are like, okay, I'm not exactly seeing a big column of light like in the Pleiades, and I'm not exactly seeing these variegated green-gray beings or green-peach beings from Otur. I'm seeing the bobble-headed, humongous eyeballs that you've ever seen in your life. You're seeing a gray. Now, some of the characteristics of grays that are a little intriguing are that they have very thin necks. They have bulby heads, kind of what we consider to be the classic alien head. They've got little pot bellies, actually. They're kind of cute, like little baby pot bellies, and really thin arms and legs. And they're not very tall. Most Greys on average, I would say, I don't know. I want to say maybe they're 3-ish feet tall on average. So where do these beings come from if they're related to the beings from Otur? And just as a refresher course, the beings from Otur, all the Oturan are from a realm that if you look at Orion and you look at the belt of Orion, and from our perspective here on Earth, you see the middle star and the star out to the end. And of course, if you go between those two stars right there and keep going, you're going to hit the Oturan space out there. So where are the Greys from? Okay, now this is going to get a little odd, except to tell you that they are related, yet the Greys themselves do not have a planet. They travel around on very large craft. I mean, if you want to think of the Death Star or a Borg cube or anything like that, that's a little over the top. But I mean, literally, they are giant craft that they travel on. And these beings were originally designing themselves to be a hybrid master race. Now, what is the deal, man, with beings wanting to be the master race, right? We had that problem with Nazi Germany. And of course, a bunch of people thinking that Caucasian folks were the human master race. So stupid. Yet if we look back at this, well, what we're able to see here is that the beings, the Oturan, who began to noodle with their genome, and that's exactly what happened, to later become what we call the Greys, then those beings didn't start out thinking, I'm going to be a master race. What happened with the Greys, and this was several 100,000 years ago, from what I can tell, from talking to the folks actually who frequent here from Oturan, what happened with the Greys is the same kind of thing that happens with our science communities here on Earth. They wanted to make disease be gone, even though the Otur realm has very little disease. Many of those beings have worked on raising their vibration to the point where there's kind of no disease there because everybody's got this incredibly high resonation. Although, people do die, beings do die. The Oturan have a life and death cycle, and illness does happen. So if you can imagine the Greys being a sect of scientific and spiritual beings who originally were Oturan, and they decided that by entering in science and trying to remove certain genes from their race, all right, that they could get to a place where they didn't have the best I can tell you is that the Greys were efficiency nuts. I mean, they didn't want biosystems that literally weren't necessary, okay? So what would be a necessary or non-necessary biosystem? Well, to the Greys, reproduction. Reproduction, man. They see that as somewhat unnecessary for all beings to carry a reproductive organ because that uses resources in a being's body to run, as if we were human, to run a set of testes or to run a womb and 2 ovaries. So they thought, hey, not everybody's going to be reproducing. We probably don't need bodies that always have this option of reproducing. And I'm not saying, you guys, that the Oturan reproduce in the same way humans do. They don't. However, for the Greys, that was a big deal. So they decided that they were going to engineer themselves. This is just one of many, many systems that they felt were unnecessary. And the reason they were streamlining themselves genetically is, the best I could tell you is, it started out as somewhat of a scientific venture, but really it was more of, actually I could say it's more of a religious, some kind of a religious attribute in them that made them want to become more like creation or more perfect. So by human standards, the Greys were religious fanatics and they were scientists. Now, can you imagine a culture where the scientists were the religious fanatics? Definitely not Earth. But anyway, so what we had here is, originally we had Oturan folks who wanted to be more perfect, in the reflection of the eyes of the All, or the one that is all, or God, figured that they had been given a lot of scientific knowledge and started noodling with their genome. We call it gene editing here on Earth. So these are super, super wide brushstrokes, gang, of what the heck was going on with the Greys in the first place. All right. So the Greys, they ended up noodling so much with themselves that, again, they felt that living on a planet, being assigned to a rock in space, did not fully elevate the species to the place where it could literally transcend its body and become one with God, one with space. So this is why they developed very, very large craft, and everybody migrated onto these craft. Again, I want you to think religious fanatics, okay? Building an ark in the sky. Except they weren't quite as creepy as our Earth religious fanatics. I gotta tell you, gang, we really do have a freaking corner on the market as far as really odd religious ideologies driving us to do very strange things. Something about human beings, I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, we love to have really odd rituals based in either deep spirituality, deep superstition, deep hope, or all of the above. Okay? Now, the Oturan are a little different. They, of course, channel energies through their body. They channel energies through their psychic gifts. As we talked, they channel energies through their buildings, okay? So they're channeling energy on a regular basis. Now, the Greys, being originally from Otur, believed in channeling energy, yet they thought that channeling it through the ground, channeling it through each other, channeling it through bodies that could also reproduce in their own ways or break down food or eat was a waste of the actual energy. So the Greys sought out initially, and this is how it's been explained to me, and I'm doing my best to get all these details in, and it was explained to me from the folks from Otur, who kind of have this like eye roll experience. You know, like when you have that really weird family member who maybe lives in the jungle of Guatemala in the body of a rusted out, downed plane that they've buried in the ground, and they've got it retrofit for a disaster, and that person doesn't have any credit cards and they don't have any identifying factors, and they've sanded off their fingertips and shaved down their teeth because they don't want to be identified. Okay, I want you to think of how the eye roll would be if that individual was in your family, right? So we have this whole really interesting and unusual turn of events with the Greys in that they are Oturan. They do understand that universal sense of connection. Yet at the same time, they kind of don't want to be restricted to one planet, and they don't want their resources slowed down, channeling through stones and channeling through individuals. So this gets wildly interesting to me because we're getting into some territory here that really starts to become, again, fanatical for that race. So this is what we're dealing with the Greys. Now, you got to consider, gang, that this was hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's not like the Greys just noodled with themselves last week, okay? This was quite a long time ago. So when you get the opportunity to look at it from that perspective, these beings have had augmented genetics for a long time. So they, at this point, really don't have all that much in common culturally with the folks from Otur because they've been out on their floating ships for a long time. They've been out on their ark having their religious cults or whatever else you want to call it for a really long time. A really long time. So what I can tell you is that with the Greys, they've noodled with their genome to augment and take out their reproductive systems. And they reproduce externally, basically to just do the best they can to replace their species. And they have the same telepathic, I guess, gift as the folks from Oturan. Except for the Greys, they don't necessarily believe in the idea of individualism. Again, they were trying to purify themselves and they were trying to become one with creation. All right? So think about this. This is a group of beings that share a telepathic connection, yet do not share the belief or the adherence to the idea of an individual id or ego, because that separates you from creation. Okay? Think about it that way. So what you've got are these giant populations of these beings that operate as what we like to call a hive mind. You know, one does it and is translating to the universal consciousness or the all consciousness of the group. One's doing something, washing a dish, I don't know, doing whatever. But everybody is in sync with that one action. It doesn't mean they're all washing dishes. It means that, okay, that one's washing dishes, so I'm going to automatically go grab a towel, and I'm going to automatically go open up the cupboard and begin to put dishes away, to give you an example. Everybody's working in a perfect chorus for perfect synchronicity. And the closest thing I can tell you that we can relate with on Earth where the Greys are concerned would be AI. or a large computer system where one function starts acting in a certain way, and because that code has been triggered, another function in the computer chain begins to act in another way. That's a thing. So the Greys operate literally as a hive, And that's different from the Oturan, because the Oturan, they operate individually, yet aware of each other telepathically. So they operate on the highest good or behalf of the group, yet they're individuals. And they're kind of checking in on a psychic or spiritual or empathic level with the whole planet, saying, hey, here's what I want to do. What do you think? So the Greys are interesting. The Greys are really interesting. And I have to say, if I was being completely transparent here, that of all the off-world races that I have the opportunity to chat with, and there are actually a few I've had a chance to chat with that said, hey, could you just not mention this? Because it's just not our time yet. And I said, sure, that's not a thing. However, there are beings that have been here that have inspired great lore, that have inspired the idea of dragon people or alligator people or all kinds of stuff. And there's a reason those beings don't really want a lot of that gone into right this second. We'll get into it at some point. They told me I could. But right now, they're like, could you hold off on that? Because we got some other stuff we're doing, and that just makes us sound super creepy, and you all got enough problems. So just timing. So anyway, back to the Greys. So what I was getting at is that of all the particular, I would say, races that I've had a chance to visit with that are off-worlders, and this makes me feel kind of bad to be really, really, really upfront with you right now. The Greys kind of creep me out. Not gonna lie. You know, they're a little creepy. They don't have that individual chewiness that other beings have. And, you know, I'm human, obviously, at least last I checked. And so I relate with that individual thought process, with that individual chewiness. What I do not relate with is this hive that just does stuff for the sake of being efficient about doing it. And the other thing that the Greys removed, they removed many things out of their genome, was unnecessary brain function where emotionality came into play. Because you have to remember, they also removed genes in them, in their bodies, that would make their bodies smaller. Because again, we're living off world, right? So if I'm going to go to space, are we going to shoot a bunch of 6'9", 380-pound guys in space that require a ton of food if they're going to go on a long journey? Yeah, probably not. Probably not NASA, unless NASA's figured out something that we don't know about to keep all that oxygen going and all those people fed. So the Greys were considering their size, living off-world and living in this, what was then to them a colony of perfection in these giant ships. So they made their bodies smaller and they made their brains bigger. Yet they took out a lot of the synaptic nodes that would create, and a lot of the, actually not just the synaptic nodes, but also the chemical nodes in the brain and any subsequent Oturan organs, which would create some chemicals that could be translated by their brain as emotion. And human beings are not the only species out there that uses neural triggers that are chemical. Obviously, the Oturan have like this completely different brain setup. We have one brain with two lobes, and the Oturan have these massive brains that have 8 lobes in them. 8 lobes, people. And so, and they've developed, and actually the Greys took it down to 4 because they felt that some of those other lobes were unnecessary and the way that they processed were unnecessary. So you've got these brains that have 4 lobes in them, 2 in the front and 2 in the back, like just basically separate our brain in the middle, kind of, sort of, is what it looks like. And so they took out a lot of function that would indicate emotionality or empathy or any of this, because as a hive mind, they are operating in chorus, mostly sticking to themselves. So that translational aptitude of emotion wasn't as important to them. Now, keep in mind, this is a scientifically brilliant race. So they just keep weeding all this stuff out. They also felt that emotion, if we want to go Vulcan here for a minute for all my Star Trek fellow fans out there, they also kind of felt that emotion was a waste of their body's resources. Because bodies, resources, turn into chemicals when we're talking brain function, right? So the Greys were like, okay, we're going to be closer to God. We're going to live on a floating planet called a ship. We're going to make our bodies smaller so we don't need to actually be feeding these herking bodies, which the Oturan body is not that beefy anyway, but they made them smaller. They said, okay, we're going to have a bigger head. We're going to have 4 lobes instead of 8 lobes in our brain, but our brain itself is going to be structured very differently, and it's going to be the supercomputer. So one of the things that the Greys really excelled at was trying to figure out, well, hey, if we're going to make a smaller body with a bigger head, we need a strong skeleton. We need a strong neck. Because also they took out in their genome eating. And granted, the folks from Uturan, they have a very different eating cycle. They don't necessarily chew and swallow and pee and poo like we do here on Earth. Yet they do eat. They do ingest. They catch vibration. They catch color sources. There's all kinds of, I guess I'd say, suck it in through the air type of eating that they do. Yet it does break down into nutrients in their body. And the Greys were like, well, that's stupid. If we're not feeding a great big body, why do we need all this nutrients? So they do eat this gross. I think it's gross. And again, I'm going to sound judgy as can be, and I apologize, everybody. Yet honestly, the Greys, they have a right to live, and they're out there living, and I kind of feel sorry for them, and I'll get to why in a minute. Yet they're just so not like any other living beings that I've run across. They are very unique, and they're very almost animatronic in the way that they behave, and they eat this paste. It's a paste. It's like a gray, chalky tasting. When I've tried to key in with them before, it kind of tastes like mushy algae, but it doesn't even have that much personality. It almost tastes like nothing. But this is what they eat. It's just this gray paste. And they just suck it out of a tube once in the morning and suck it out of a tube once in the evening, and they're done. And they don't think a lot about eating, because eating, of course, is not it's not an enjoyable function, it's an essential function. So they've really pared down their system. So far you can see body size, brain function, what they feel is important to have in the brain. They've pared down things like empathy, and they've pared down emotionality to just be the base function in order to survive as their unit. And again, the Greys really keep to themselves a lot, okay? So you've got this whole group that is not out among them in the universe. They're kind of their own science, religious, I wouldn't say it's a cult. Well, I guess, but it's a race at this point. So these beings are eating very minimally. They are communicating telepathically to be an autonomous hive function. And they've been really successful, actually, in, I would say, engineering non-organic material into their bone structure. Because as we were saying earlier, they've got these little pencil necks and these big bobbleheads on top of them. So they've needed to lighten their skeletons up considerably, because if you look at the human skull, it's quite thick. We're a little thick-headed. Yeah, human skulls are thick. And so to have this feature or function and be a Grey would be breaking your own neck with the thickness of your skull. So they actually have developed ways to incorporate non-biological fibers into their bone structure to be able to make a hybrid, very high impact. Like you could nail a Grey in the head and not crack their skull, though it's much more thin. It's a lot thinner than ours is. So they've made these bone structures to be very high tensile strength. And if you think about carbon nanotubes or anything that's little teeny like that and is a fiber that wraps around their skeletal structure, that's really what they've done. So the grays have these super strong skeletons that are what we think of as carbon fiber. It's not exactly carbon fiber, but they have this fascinating element to them that is synthetic in essence because it's stronger and it's more efficient. So what I think is fascinating is the grays themselves never set out to be creepy, scary, awful, terrible, any of the stuff that I'm making them sound like, which is not very nice. And again, I'm coming at this through my own bias because I myself have a bit of a hard time with these beings. They've got a weird vibe. I don't know. I feel so guilty saying this. I'm just going to talk. It's kind of like, have you ever seen like a big fat hairy spider that you're not anticipating and it's just sitting there? Like you're moving boxes and there's just this big spider. And at least spiders have a point on being on the earth. Yet grays feel like that weird, quiet, 4-eyeballed spider thing just kind of looking at you. 8-eyeballed spider thing just looking at you. You know, like, hey, what's up, man? I don't care about you. And so it's a very weird vibration if you encounter grays. And human beings have encountered grays a lot. They've been coming to this planet for a long time. And they seek fuel here. They're one of the races that actually takes gold and breaks gold down, not for its monetary aspect, but they break it down for its chemical aspect. It's how they run their ships. Really, I would say, as technologically advanced as the species of grays are, they really are lacking in the area of technology compared to races like Sirius AB or even the Oturan. And it's like they've taken all of their technological genius and they've put it into trying to reverse engineer their species to be more efficient. They're efficiency nuts. If grays were a sign, they'd be a Virgo. Except for the fact that Virgos are so much more warm than grays, let me just tell you. So, as you can see, the grays are a very unique species, and they visited here quite a bit. Not only for the precious metals, and for the usage of those metals in terms of propulsion for the way that they fly. And again, they have a little more of the putt-putt craft, yet they've been looking for genome here on Earth for a long time. Because, as we've discussed in other podcasts, when you noodle with the genome of any living being and you remove something, then you end up removing something that you didn't want to remove that's attached to the thing that you wanted to remove. For instance, I use this analogy quite a bit. Yet tomatoes, okay, tomatoes on the planet Earth. There are large, creepy Monsanto tomatoes out there that are genetically engineered to keep the bugs from eating them. Now, how does a tomato tell a bug not to eat it? Because that's pretty extraordinary, right? Well, the first thing the tomato does is make sure that the bug can't smell it. So when we remove the smell, that also removes a lot of the taste. And bugs tend to be drawn to the juiciness of a tomato. That's part of where the smell is. So you have to take out some of the liquid in the tomato. So have you ever gone to the grocery store and picked up a tomato and it's hard and it doesn't smell like anything and you get it home and you cut it open and it's real woody inside? You know what I'm talking about? For we Italians, that's like an abomination. You don't mess with the tomato. The tomato in Italian cuisine it's the foundation of all fabulous food. That and great flour, okay? So you don't mess with the tomato. This is how unholy Monsanto is, but I digress. So if you think about the grays being tomatoes, maybe they just wanted to remove a little of the smell, except they took out the taste, they took out the juice, they took out the flavor. So here you have these bodies that in the attempt to be more streamlined, they've really hobbled themselves genetically. So the grays for a long time were coming to Earth and harvesting genome, because we've got a very diverse genome down here. And the human genome not only contains genes that we're not using because we're not sure how to use them in our bodies yet. Yet we also contain different genome from Sirius AB, and it's been amalgamated into our own gene pool. We have Sirius, not only Sirius genes, but we've got Oturan genes. So we've got all kinds of genes running around that have successfully been integrated with the indigenous mammals of the planet Earth. Those are humans. And then we've got just, the indigenous beings that don't have any alien DNA in them, yet most people have that alien DNA that they're working with. So as you can see, this gets to this point where we are operating from a perspective, looking at the grays, of seeing beings that in their quest for perfection are now at a T. They're at a crossroads because they've over-perfected themselves and they need to back out of some of these particular avenues that they've taken themselves in over the last 100,000 years, trying to achieve this perfection. So there's been a lot of egg harvesting, sperm harvesting, different types of tissue harvesting from humans in an attempt from them actually to be able to reverse engineer and put back some of these genes that they took out. Now, according to the Oturan folks I've spoken with, because the grays are not chatty, they don't chat you up. They could care less. They just look at you with those great big glassy eyeballs. They just look at you and vibe you out, and you're either part of their function or not part of their function. Again, we're talking about a race here that's missing a lot of its compassion and empathy, okay? So imagine honest to God, I honestly think a great white shark has more thought process and vibe process than does a gray. I mean, if it's going to serve the higher function in the gray colony, they'll take a human being and slab them on a big old metal slab or whatever they've got and just start cutting into you because they kind of need your organs. Sorry, man. So the grays are a little bit Halloween-y, nightmarish from the perspective that they don't share any emotional connection like we do. But they do share a hive mind, whose energy, if it's jacked up enough, can cause them distress or can cause them to back off or can cause them to stand down if the hive is rocked or like bees and shaken. I honestly think bees have more of a personality than the grays do. And maybe they do have a personality, gang, and maybe I just don't really get them because they're so different than I am. Yet it's from what I've honestly been able to tell about these beings. They are not wandering around winning popularity contests anywhere out there in the universe. So here they were coming to Earth, borrowing genome, trying to get in there and fix the tomato that's now missing its smell, taste, color, texture, juice, everything, but no bugs are eating it. So they're trying to re-engineer all this. Well, if we look at the primary types of abduction stories, talks about little gray men or little green men, and they're short and they take people when they're in bed and they zip them away. And so, a lot of the abduction technology that the grays would use would be something similar to the folks from Otur, only the folks from Otur really have no desire to pop down here and abduct human beings. I mean, that's just kind of not their thing. They can if they're running us through a few tests here and there, but they're not here to cut our hearts out and our organs and harvest everything like we see the grays doing. Yet, if you look around the time that the nuclear program hit in the 1940s, the first time that we developed the bomb and took all the Russian scientists and the German scientists over here and created the nuclear bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Right about that time, we were also reading a tremendous amount of stories of people being abducted and taken aboard craft and having experiments run on them. Now, This gets into some wonkola territory for a second because we're just going to put a pin in all of that discussion, and I'm going to speed you up to our current time frame, okay? So we'll go back to those abductions. But here we are in our current time frame. Now people are reporting UFOs that are triangular. They have all this weird etching on the outside. They're reporting deformed beings coming out and stealing them and dragging them back to ships and doing terrible things to them. And I will tell you that there are bummer parts of the United States scientific community. I'm not going to call them part of our government because they're not actually part of the government, yet the government funds them, taxpayers fund them. And there are these Pentagon secret black ops programs that have reversed engineered UFO technology to a large degree. Now, this technology still can't go through wormholes, as we've discussed. That still rips people apart, and we're still not quite sure how to make that happen. Yet we can, if you will, call it defy gravity with craft. We've figured out how to make craft with zero buoyancy. And we've also figured out, because of people's innate fears of creepy small aliens that abduct them in the middle of the night and take them somewhere and do something terrible to them, we, as a creepy shadow government or black ops program, recognize that human beings are afraid of the monster. So these same black ops programs, I crap you not, gang, this is the honest to Jesus Christ God truth, went in and created animatronic, creepy looking little aliens and stuck them on these reverse engineered zero gravity craft or UFOs, and then would park them in somebody's field and have these creepy little things wander out and noodle around the house of people and scare them half to death. And I mean, literally. And it's not that far off, gang. I mean, if you think about going to Disneyland and watching the Hall of the Presidents and all the different presidents that talk and blah, just imagine something that doesn't have to look like a person or move like a person. That's going to be a lot easier to fabricate if you really, 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 really think about it. So why would our government, or not even our government, gang, it's not our government. Why would these wackadoodles in these black ops Pentagon programs bother making little animatronic aliens that scare the holy rolling crap out of people and poke them with needles and do all these terrible things? When, if we go back to the pin I put in the discussion earlier, that was actually happening in the 1940s, in the 1950s, and up until the 1960s, and really to the very early 70s. Why would we create an army of animatronic, fake, creepy aliens to freak people out? Well, because the Greys stopped coming. You heard that correctly. The one thing about the Greys, gang, I can go on and on about how they kind of creep me out and they're kind of like spiders or they're like this or like that or whatever. But honestly, gang, the Greys, again, remember, they are efficiency nuts. They are efficiency nuts. And when they are challenged and something is not efficient at that point, they bail. They let it go. So these beings were coming around, actually really it started in the 30s, the 1930s, trying to abduct people and moving around all of the genome and trying to fix their own genome problems. When they figured out they couldn't make it work, they tried basically later 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and the beginning of the 1970s, they stopped coming. Well then, these creepy black ops weirdos lost their greatest monster ever. Because the Greys were like, oh, this isn't working. I guess our species is just going to continue to die off. And that's what's happening with them. That's why I was saying that I feel badly for them. Because their species is literally dying. And I know it's easy to say, right? Like, well, wait a minute. If they're so excellent at science, how come they can't just make themselves keep going? The problem is, again, they over-noodled, and over time in a gravity-less environment, even though they have some simulated gravity, it eroded their bodies. And even though they do have hulls that their ships, HULL, their hulls that protect them from outer space resonance and all kinds of deep space radiation and all kinds of things, even though that's at play, there were still, over time, elements of being in space constantly that they did not anticipate. And I could go into that, but I'll bore you to tears on the science. But basically, it eroded their body. Okay. And they could not have necessarily foreseen that because nobody had ever lived out in space that long. The Oturan travel, the Sirius AB folks travel, the Pleiadians travel, but they don't just sit there up in freaking space forever. For God's sakes. One craves a mango after a while and some ocean. Come on. So these beings encountered, even in their greatest projections, difficulty with their genome, and it started shutting down. So they came here, they tried to resurrect some pieces of our genome in order to introduce it into their gene cycles. That didn't help. So they're kind of stuck, and they quit coming. So when our Creeper McCreepers in our governments lost their big monster, they recognized that they could create the monster themselves and then have the perfect foil. You know, an alien invasion with these creepy things wandering through the hills, eating goats or something. Keep the people suppressed. Keep them scared. I mean, even in the Greys' worst human harvesting cycles, they didn't just pick people up and, not give them back. I mean, they abducted people, and sometimes those people would die when they put them back, which was super tragic. Or the people were super traumatized when they put them back. But they would put them back. And the United States knew that these abductions were happening. And in the late 1950s, the government of the United States of America went into a treaty with the Greys about allowing them to abduct certain people or certain numbers of people, not exactly certain people, but certain numbers of people in exchange for technology and in exchange for not trying to shoot their ships down. You can read about it. The Greada Treaty, Greada. It's creepy. And they literally, like it's going to do any good. We signed a treaty with the aliens saying, hey, I tell you what, you can just, abduct a few of our people in exchange for some of your technology. And that'll be the trade. And we won't shoot you down and you won't take everybody. And really what happened is the Greys took whoever they wanted anyway. And they gave us technology, but they just took whoever they wanted anyway. And there was no way to enforce this treaty. I mean, talk about a very interesting turn of karma to a government that made and broke and violated and made and broke countless treaties with our indigenous nations, people here when they came over and overran the native populations. And here they're trying to make a treaty with this technologically advanced species who could care less about them. I mean, it's hysterical. It's laughable. It is laughable. The ego of the human species, especially of, the very white man military species of the 1950s and McCarthyism, and we've got to stay ahead of the curve, and oh my God. So anyway, that's one of the reasons that the government recognized that they weren't coming around anymore, because they weren't. So why would they do all this to keep people in line and create monsters? Well, to keep people in line and to keep the monsters in their minds and to be able to corral people with fear. That's literally what these false flag operations are, that are simulating a gray abduction or a gray attack. So I can honestly tell you, if you ever see a bunch of little creepy beings in a field that are running after you trying to eat your cat, that's not a gray, okay? A gray might waddle up and just look at you. And actually, one of the things that they learned from harvesting our eggs and our sperm and looking at our genome is that they learned that the spiritual connection that we have to something that is non-tangible, that comes through our double-lobed brain, that was vital to our life force, and it was vital to how we related with one another. And the poor Greys were like, oh, shoot, maybe we shouldn't have taken out all this empathy and stuff. So that was one of the things that was somewhat successful, just a little bit, was trying to figure out how to put back in a little bit of that connection or a little bit of that awareness of vibration or vibes around them, not just from the fed data of the hive working on something, but from the individual, although it's to a very minimal amount. So if you were to see a gray out in the middle of the desert, it's going to freak you out. It's just going to stare at you. You're not going to catch hardly any vibe of it at all. It's just going to be this being just looking at you like a spider or a shark in the dark, just looking at you. And you're not going to be able to clock that being at all, except you may be able to feel the smallest tinge of curiosity, because they were a bit successful in putting back just the tiniest bit of experiential sharing in their brain. So it's not as bad if you run into a gray now as, say, if you would have run into them in the 70s or 60s or even in the 80s or 90s. They seem to have kind of gotten a little bit of this groove. And the 2 abduction attempts that I've had, one which I think was successful, the other one which I don't think was successful, I believe a lot of that gray technology was being utilized. And that's the abduction experience that I talked about, where it was kind of like the floor opened up, or it seemed like it opened up, and there was this big light that came through and all these different things that happened. And that was more really gray. I would say it was not necessarily gray technology, but it was the ka-chink, ka-chunk, ka-chink, the very mechanical sounds. It had some kind of gray affiliation to it, because even the way that when I sat up when I wasn't supposed to sit up during that abduction attempt, that startled the whole mechanism so badly that the beings all stepped back in concert. The weird rectangular shaped haze that like a mist that was on top of me flew off of me. I mean, it was literally bizarre. It was a bizarre situation. And again, so much of that Bluetoothed together chorus of action was very gray. Although the fact that they were kind of poking holes in space-time, that was a little more Oturan. So I suppose they could have reverse engineered something. But it was pretty old school with the mechanical sounds and whatnot. And again, the Greys put a lot of their science into their bodies, not into their travel. Because that's another thing. They don't really have a big desire to go a whole lot of places. I mean, they don't need to go a whole lot of places. They're traveling with their whole planet with them all the time. And what's cool about that for them is that they are not conquerors. The Greys are a combination of scientists, religious extremists, monks, if you could imagine beings that don't even believe in a sense of self. And like our closest definition of the Greys, in the definition that I'm talking about here, as humans, you'll find online, if you Google Zeta Reticuli, which is a star system out in the Orion area, Zeta Reticuli, and that's Zeta Reticuli. It's spelled exactly like it sounds. You're going to get a bunch of varied information. And what I'm not such a fan of when speaking about off-world cultures is lumping all of the beings from the Zeta Reticuli area into calling them Greys, because it's really not accurate. The Greys themselves are now long-distance cousins from the Oturan, who were out in the Orion area. And the Oturan can be very enlightened, and they can be exceptionally helpful and great teachers. And they've come to me in dreamscapes, and they've put me through lots of different, training courses. And I've talked about that in previous podcasts, and some of them I passed and some of them I didn't pass. Yet the Greys themselves, what we think of as a gray alien with the little bobbleheads and whatnot, especially with the pronounced large heads and the large eyes, those are beings that were noodled with, and they noodled with themselves genetically. So again, there's many types of grayish beings with sort of that diamond shape or heart-shaped head and larger eyes or almond eyes. The Greys also, certain groups of them, really had a hard time with light after a while. And so the large eyes, some of them didn't actually have eyes that large. That was more like a helmet or a suit that went over their eyeballs and shielded their eyes. Other people in the gray community, other beings in the gray community, actually were able to integrate that technology that allows them to take something that is synthetic and work it into their actual, not only their mechanisms of their skeleton, but also their eyeballs and their organs. Okay. So what you've got is you've got these gray aliens who are engineered, and some genetically have these humongous eyeballs because they're out in low light areas floating around on their little planet that they've made for themselves on their ship. And some of them actually have engineered these false eyes or these synthetic eyes to be part of their skulls. Now, what's interesting about this, if you really want to really wrap this around for the big jazz hands ending, okay? Google Star Child skull. This is so cool. So here's what the Star Child skull is all about. In the 1920s in Mexico, come by the fire. In the 1920s in Mexico, there was a cave, and a farmer, rancher owned the cave and was noodling around up there and found a skull in the cave. And the skull was weird. It was that typical gray shape, but a little flatter. It wasn't quite so perfectly bulby. A traditional gray head looks a lot more like an old GE light bulb. It's that real bulby on top and kind of narrow at the bottom. This skull looked more like if you combined a human being with this alien. I mean, it was a big bulby top, but it was flatter. It wasn't as round, and it had eyeballs. The eyeball mechanisms in the skull were a little different. You know, if you look at a human skull, you can see where the holes in the back of the human skull are that the optic nerve grows through from the brain and everything going out to the eyeballs. So the holes for this Star Child skull, where the eyeballs were different. They were set very differently. So what's interesting is they took this skull, and of course they ran DNA tests on it, and the DNA tests came back. You can read very in-depth on the Star Child skull, very in-depth material, but the large brushstroke is that it came back with a human mother and a father of unknown origin. And the other thing that was fascinating about the Star Child skull was that the bone material itself was partially calcium and partially this other weirdo fiber that we don't even know what it is. And it adheres itself to the particles or to the fibers of the human bone, or whatever this thing is, this hybrid bone. So what happened is that the Star Child skull is thin, it's very thin, and it's very strong. And that's another attribute of the gray race. And what they think happened is that a woman went up there and had a baby, and of course the baby died, and it was this hybrid being. But the Star Child skull is pretty fascinating, the way that it's shaped. And it really does look an awful lot like skulls that they were finding down in Peru. All of that mechanism of travel that the off-worlders were using, the ley lines and the electromagnetic jump points from the middle part of South America, that whole area is just littered with skulls this shape or longer skulls that kind of come up and out the back. And that's really more the Oturan style. And then you're getting into the Sirius AB style. So Star Child skull, check it out. It's very interesting. And you can see somewhat the fibrous nature of how these beings attach synthetic fibers to organic material, as well as seeing the shape of a gray, if a gray were to hook up with a chick, which it kind of looks like that's what happened. And really it made a little bit of sense because, again, keep in mind that these grays were trying to harvest or create some sort of genome chain between people and them so they could fix the problems they were having. And again, once they couldn't fix it, they quit coming around. So really quickly, kind of going back to this whole idea of a shadow government or a shadow scientific community creating monsters and UFOs, and why would they do that? Well, they would do that, gang, because we are so close as a species on this planet. We are so close to not buying into the idea of warring with one another that it's ridiculous. Believe it or not, I know you might watch the news and think we've all gone to complete and utter hell in a handbasket, but that's not true. It's just not true. And one of the things I can tell you with extreme clarity here is that in the midst of everything that we've been going through, humans are really wanting to connect right now. And that's why extraterrestrial species have been trying to contact us. Yeah, they have. I mean, why do you think Dr. Stephen Greer and the CE5 app, the Close Encounters 5 app, is such a big thing right now? They've been trying to contact us so that they could give us healing technologies and technologies that can help with the earth. And a lot of these beings deal in consciousness, gang. They don't deal in putt-putt space gene manipulation. That's why the Greys kind of came and went down here. And it's not that they don't still visit, and sometimes they do come around. And these beings from the Zeta Reticuli and other areas of the Orion constellation do look somewhat like Greys in varying degrees, just like all humans look a little alike, yet we've got different races of humans that look a little different. But the Greys are really specific to who and what they were. And you can't miss them because they're a little eerie. And that's why the United States shadow weird scientist government weirdo people decided to model the monsters after something that was naturally a little bit creepy. You know, because really reality is weirder than fiction on so many different levels. So this is covering these 3 podcasts on the Sirius AB folks and what they brought to the earth, on the Oturan and what they brought to the earth, which set us up for our gray discussion and the Zeta Reticuli beings, although they're not all grays. However, they can be gray, but they are not grays or what we would call grays. Actually, do you know what the Greys call themselves? They call themselves Oturan Nak, and it means of the Oturan or developed from the Oturan. Oturan Nak. And so they call themselves that. And so they're not Zeta Reticuli beings. They are a very specific race that is in the process of dying off, gang, because they're not going to be able to maintain their physical structure. Maybe some of them will and have natural genetic abnormalities that will allow them to continue onward. Yet there's been a lot of races who's been reaching out to them and saying, hey man, if y'all just don't want to roll around in your big old ship up there and die off slowly over another 100,000 years, we'd be happy to have you on our planet. We'd be happy to integrate you. Yet at this point, the Greys the Oturanach are so dependent on one another for who they are, and it's their culture to not be away from one another. It's their culture to be with each other. So in their own way, they have their own emotionality. In their own way, they have a valuable emotional currency. It's just not anything that's going to look like anything that we recognize here on Earth, because they're just way out there. So I saved the Greys for October because they really are kind of creepy. And if you know of anyone who has had a creepy experience or a creepy memory from childhood of being abducted, there are individuals that work through hypnotherapy and trauma response to unleash that trauma and get it out of the subconscious. One of the things that the Greys do excel in is being able to tuck, I'm going to use this term from a TV show I've been watching called The Haunting of Bly Manor, but is to tuck away the trauma that happens to people when they experience these abductions. And there's some really awful ones on record, you know, if you look at A Fire in the Sky, or the movie A Fire in the Sky about this guy who got sucked up by a spaceship and bad things were happening. And I think that was in the 70s that took place. So, you know, not to say it all cut off in the 70s. There might have been a few stray ships trying to still harvest or take some sort of genome. But honestly, right around that time is when they stopped coming. So what can we learn from the Greys? Well, one of the things we can learn from the Greys is that if we over-noodle with nature, it's going to kill us. And we're seeing that with our planet right now. We're seeing that with global warming and climate change that many people don't want to acknowledge and believe it's real. My God, here in Montana, Lord, our one lone representative in the House of Representatives to Congress, Greg Gianforte, believes with his heart of hearts that the earth is no more than 6,000 years old because that's what the Bible says. And this gentleman has donated money, over $200,000, to a creationist museum out in the eastern part of Montana where they do the dinosaur digs. And if you go out there, you'll see this creationist museum that talks about dinosaurs being on the ark with Noah. And that it's a big conspiratist lie of science that dinosaurs were around millions and millions of years ago, that the whole earth is 6,000 years old. And old Greg Gianforte, God bless him, he thinks that's the truth. And so when we have that consciousness running around and in positions of power, like in Washington, D.C., you can imagine why more and more of our off-world friends have not just landed and said, let's have a picnic, let's get along. If you encounter a gray, you'll know. They feel very weird. They'll feel mildly curious. They will feel eerie as all get out. They will not feel at all like they're from here. They will feel like there's no way you can possibly relate with them. And the gray culture has now devised a broadcast to the human brain that can be more like, don't worry, be happy. Don't worry, be happy. But it's not a very emotional one, and it feels kind of creepy in its don't worry, be happiness. However, knowing what you know now about the folks from Oturan and the folks from Sirius AB and our gray friends and all of the other subsequent races of beings out in the Zeta Reticuli area, and there's these reptilians and this and that and the other thing. But they're not as much part of our genome, our heritage, or our culture, although they've had a few run-ins with humans here and there. And I'm not even going to get started on the Anunnaki stuff right now because for any of you who follow UFO lore, there's this big, almost a religion around these off-world beings that they call the Anunnaki that came here and ruled over humanity. And really, that's more what we call the races of beings who we might think look a little reptile-y in the way that they're structured. However, those beings have been trying to right some wrongs that they really cast down onto this earth thousands and thousands of years ago, and have really asked me to it's like, could you just not go on and on about those old stories because we're really trying to do better. It'd be like if all we ever did when we referenced Germany was talk about Hitler. Obviously Germany is so much more than Hitler. The Germans are so much more than people who had Hitler as a ruler. So, yeah, there's other beings out there. There's all kinds of other life forms out there that aren't even in our same realm of understanding. However, those are the three biggies, and they certainly are the three biggies who have contributed the most outside of a little, reptilian hoedown here and there, on and off, enslaving people on and off with humanity. Those other beings, aliens, ETs, have really contributed to our culture, to our lore, to our architecture and our religion. And that's why I chose them for this 3-podcast series on ETs. There you go, gang. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. And of course, I'll continue to cover UFO stuff here on Insight Radio. I'm a ufologist. I love all that stuff. Yet, to be perfectly just upfront with you, I get a little bored when information that's to be delivered is nothing more than just kind of reading or bringing forward articles that have been read and passed around a bunch of times. So I try to keep the ET information here that I do share with you on the podcast really fresh, and information that some of it is documented, like the Greada Treaty and whatnot. Yet I try to keep it fresh, especially from the perspective of beings that I've had firsthand dealings with, and try to clear up the record on some erroneous information out there about our off-world communities, because we don't need that floating around. All right, gang, I've enjoyed doing the alien thing. We'll get to it more later in the podcast series. But for now, I hope you are enjoying your fall where you are on the planet of Earth. And if you do dress up like a gray to do any Zoom Halloween, parties with people, make sure to let them know that you are a gray, not just a Zeta Reticuli alien, because there's a difference. All right, gang. Everybody take care, and I will see you next podcast.